Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Melissa Lavasani, CEO of Psychedelic Medicine Coalition. Melissa helped to bring the Washington, D.C. psychedelic decriminalization bill through, and quite successfully. We get into the history of that and talk about the creation of the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, why it's important and strategic for the movement as a whole. And a lot of really interesting stuff. And we even get into a very brand new How to Change Your Mind Netflix series that everybody's chatting about. So hope y'all enjoy this episode and learn a bunch. A lot of really fun and sometimes controversial things we get into here, and some serious things. So really all over the map. Anyway, hope y'all enjoy this one. Melissa, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you on the other side. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore, joined by Melissa Lavasani. Melissa, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great. So we're going to have a fun podcast today. I'm excited. We're going to go all over the map, which I'm really excited about. All right. So you are the CEO of the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, and yes. I'm honored and flattered to be a board member there, which is amazing. And I guess before we get into the organization, I kind of want to rewind the tape a little bit and kind of talk about, how psychedelics kind of came onto your radar. Like where did this interest come from?
Yeah. So I am a daughter of Iranian immigrants. I feel like I was a bit of a nerd growing up. I didn't really, in high school, I played tennis competitively. I went to parties, but I never really got into drugs or alcohol. I think I smoked my first joint when I was senior year after tennis season because I was so concerned about my tennis career. But I was a bit of a late bloomer for sure. But I never got into psychedelics. It was never my thing. I had friends that took it. One story in particular was a friend that took mushrooms and then went to the Minnesota State Fair, which was the worst setting ever to go to your first time on mushrooms because it's just this insane event with tens of thousands of people. And she had a terrible time. And it just kind of imprinted in my head that this is not something that's for you. You're going to be completely out of control. You're not going to know where you are, who you're with, and anybody can do anything to you. So, I think I experimented enough with other things to, truly get that out of my system. I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything, but, I got introduced to psychedelics through pretty severe mental health issues. I was pregnant with my son, my second child in 2017. And it was quite an experience. My first pregnancy was extremely uneventful. I was kickboxing up until I was 7 or 8 months pregnant. I was riding my bike everywhere, even though my family hated that. I'm pregnant and riding my bike all around Washington, D.C. But, I stayed really active. I was energetic. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was a very typical pregnancy. I had a bit of a crazy birth with her and very mild postpartum depression after she was born. But, the doctors coined that as the baby blues. So it's very normal. You go back to real life. I went back to work. I got back into my exercise regime and, things started to normalize for me. With my second pregnancy, it was almost immediately I was just miserable constantly. It was just very painful. I had sciatica. So I was in pain anytime I walked. I was in pain when I sat down. At the end of the day, I'd be in so much pain that I'd be crawling on all fours going up my stairs because I couldn't take it anymore. And that chronic pain really started to affect me mentally. So I have what you call antepartum depression during this time, which was a term I'd never even heard of. We only know about postpartum, but this was antepartum depression. I went to the doctor's office for a regular check-in and she was like, "Hey, Melissa, how are you doing today?" It's a very benign question. And I just broke down into tears and started bawling and I was apologizing and I felt terrible and embarrassed. But, she knew what she was seeing, and she very quickly got out her prescription pad and wrote me a prescription to antidepressants. And I had all these questions for her, and she kind of like brushed it off. She's like, no, this is fine. This happens all the time to women. You can get on this medication. You'll get off of it as soon as you deliver the baby. Everything will work out. And I knew that wasn't true, because I had friends who took antidepressants, and they, some friends still on antidepressants to this day. I saw how their personalities changed. I saw how much of a challenge it was to get off of the antidepressants. And I also had a friend who took his own life while on antidepressants. So that kind of imprinted in my mind that maybe it would provide me short-term relief, but it would cause long-term problems for me. And I'm about to have my second child. My family's growing. I'm at a pivotal point in my career. I don't want to create any long-term problems. So let me see if I can just manhandle my way through this and, exhaust every other avenue that would be available. So, I tried every kind of alternative therapy you could think of to combat this depression, and nothing really worked. Some things would provide me temporary relief, but, it was just kind of continuing the same dreadful kind of feeling that you feel every day. And in my mind, I assumed, well, once this pregnancy's over, I'll go back to normal like I did with my first child. And that was not the case. I had maybe about 2 weeks of blissful moments after I delivered the baby. And then I got an onslaught of chronic issues that I've always dealt with my whole life. But, I was going to the doctor constantly for these issues, and my depression came back very quickly. And it came back hard and fast. And it was worse than it had ever been when I was pregnant. The symptoms I was experiencing were nothing I'd ever experienced before. I was hearing voices at one point, and I was having panic attacks every week. I was disassociative at times. I would fantasize about how I was going to take my own life. I would literally sit in my office and look out the window and think, well, if I could get to just the top of the office building, I could just end all of this suffering right now. I could give my family a new opportunity to move on and live a happy life, because, I was just in such pain emotionally, and I felt very alone and isolated. And, I didn't really talk about this with anyone, and I tried to go to talk therapy, but for talk therapy to be really effective, you got to be all in on it, and you got to be an active participant. And I would find every excuse in the book to not go to therapy, or not, I need to change my therapist for various reasons. And it was just kind of living day to day, just being totally miserable. And I did talk to a couple friends about this who were experienced in dealing with depression. And one friend of mine said, you need to listen to this podcast with Paul Stamets. I didn't know who he was. I didn't even know that mycology was a career that somebody could have. I never heard that term before, but I listened, and it was 2.5 hours of him just blowing my mind. I had no idea that something natural that grows out of the earth can have that big of an impact on somebody. And at that point in time, it was desperation. I was really wavering between, okay, well, maybe this is just life, or maybe I just need to get on an antidepressant. But then that was coupled with the fear of, well, if I get on the wrong antidepressant, what if things get even worse? And the next worst step was me taking my life. So I was really in a dilemma with how to move forward. So when I heard about psilocybin mushrooms, I was like, let's just give this a try. What do I have to lose? My entire life, in a way. So we didn't want to talk to any of our friends, me and my husband, about this. We didn't know anybody that had psilocybin mushrooms. We're definitely not in the psychedelic scene in DC. Yeah, so we decided that we would just grow them in our house. And my husband has a little experience with psilocybin. He grew up in northeastern Alabama. Him and his friends, they would love to go eat mushrooms, see music, very jam bandy kind of vibe. But, he was very experienced with it. And he was like, I can help you. Like, I know, he's like, I can figure out how to grow them. And like, I can help you with your dosage and everything. So because he was so experienced, I trusted him. And, we started down this road and, we bought spores online where it's completely legal. All the other supplies are available at Home Depot and whatnot. And we just started to grow, and it was amazing. It was kind of like a cool little science experiment at first in our bedroom. It was fascinating to watch these things grow and to be in anticipation of like potential relief from my symptoms. But it was extremely terrifying at the same time. We have 2 little kids. My kids go to school here in DC. What if somebody found out we were doing this? What would they think about us? Would they not let their children come to our house? And and at that time, it was like, I wasn't like a negligent mother. I was just like an absent mother. I was present. I was cooking them dinner, but I wasn't really engaged and loving. So I felt like the one thing that was keeping me going was like the love for my children and like wanting to provide them with the best life I could possibly give them. And so I was like, I kept focusing on that part of it. I was like, forget about the fact that you're breaking law and you're potentially committing federal crimes with a Schedule I drug. But it was just like I was in desperate need to get myself out of the situation and to do it with as little impact as I could to my family. So hearing about microdosing, it felt like a very safe entry point for me. I was, like I said before, I still held those fears that I held about psychedelics, like just being out of control and not knowing where you are. I was lucky that, I had a husband that could control what the things you can control in that situation. But I started with the microdosing, and it was a matter of like 2-3 days where I was like feeling like my body felt different. I was holding myself up higher. I was speaking differently. I was, I feel like I could taste food again. It was, when you're depressed, your life's in black and white and everything is very muted. And then, in a way you kind of can start seeing the colors. And my husband knew that these were making a difference. That first week was when it was like the first time he'd ever seen me like sit on the floor and play with my kids in a very long time. And, it was going really well. I took it really slow. I had a journal where I would write down my dosage and, how I felt that day, because very much trial and error. I was trying to figure out like my perfect microdose. How much is that? And it was going great. I was like, I felt like I was getting my life back. So we ran out of mushrooms and we tried to grow a second batch. The second batch got contaminated. And then with the third batch, I think that we went on travel and we kind of like neglected the third batch. So like that didn't really work out. And I was kind of at a loss with what to do. Like I had an amazing experience microdosing, but I still wasn't willing to kind of put our feelers out there for anyone that we knew that would have mushrooms. I was very scared of anyone finding out about this. So like a lot of our friends didn't even realize that I was going through postpartum depression. We kept this a very private thing. And that's when I got introduced to ayahuasca through another friend of mine who, got introduced to ayahuasca through a friend of hers. So it was very much like word of mouth type situation. And I knew that I had no experience with this, but I knew it was kind of like in the same class of drugs as psilocybin. And I got such amazing relief just microdosing. Maybe I just need to go and like be present, have a ceremony and try this. So I went up to New York City and went to a stranger's apartment, drank some strange drink that tasted terrible from a man that I'd never met before, and with a bunch of people I had no idea who they were. And it was mind-blowing, like the experience itself, but also the relief I felt afterwards. So during this entire time that I'm kind of experiencing with psychedelics, I'm watching the Decriminalize Denver campaign happening, and I'm very curious about it. My husband had worked in politics in DC locally. I had volunteered for various political campaigns. So living in DC, it's just like this hyper political town where everyone's really engaged in what's going on locally and nationally. And I was fascinated that such a taboo subject matter was just being so openly discussed and seemed like it was garnering support. So after a few ayahuasca ceremonies, I was like, well, let's just explore what a campaign in DC would look like. DC was at the forefront of cannabis reform. We were pretty early on in passing decriminalization here. So why couldn't you logically do this psychedelics in DC? So we got connected to the campaign, specifically Kevin Matthews, who was very generous with like giving us the download on what was happening with the campaign, how the public was reacting, who the stakeholders were, who was helpful to him during this time. So, we watched the whole drama with, at night going to bed thinking that Decriminalize Denver lost the campaign and then waking up in the morning and finding out that they actually won. So like we were very focused on what was going on there. And slowly we got connected to various people in the psychedelic space or drug reform world in general. And, I was like, I don't know, like me and my husband would be like, where are we going with this? What, like we both have two full-time jobs at DC government. Like, what's the end goal here? And I don't think either of us really understood the end goal, but we were kind of just taking that next step. And as an opportunity presented itself, we would take it, or if somebody, we had an opportunity to get coffee with somebody, we would just, go and have a conversation about it. So then it kind of lay dormant for a little while. And out of the blue, my husband got a phone call from somebody from the Dr. Bronner's, like the social activation team here. They've got David Bronner is very engaged in drug reform. That's one of the issues he really cares about. He was supporting the Decriminalize Denver campaign, wanted to see what a Washington, D.C. campaign would look like. He was kind of in the same mindset that we were in. And he told his team to figure this out. Well, his team here in DC had previously lobbied my husband's office that he used to work at DC Council legislature. So they had his personal cell phone number already. But, they had reached out to Kevin Matthews and they said, Kevin, we want to start a campaign in DC. What does this look like? Similar to what me and my husband Daniel were doing. And Kevin goes, well, you need to really talk to Melissa about this. And so through some Facebook stalking that they did, they found out that I was married to Daniel. They already knew who Daniel was. They gave him a phone call and they said, we would like to go out to dinner with you to talk about psychedelics. And at that time I was like, sure, why not? So we go out to dinner with them and had a really great conversation. I shared with them my story, which I hadn't shared with too many people at that time. And, they said, we would like to start a campaign to decriminalize psychedelics in DC, and we want you to be the person to lead it. And my first inclination was, well, this is really exciting. Like, I think I had a really great career up until that point. I think it's, nothing too eventful. I wasn't being super inventive or like doing anything really groundbreaking. I'm a budget officer for the Department of Energy and Environment here in local DC. It was a very good, stable job. And I knew immediately that like this could be something that really kind of fulfills something in me that I've always kind of wanted. But at the same time, it would require me to come out of the closet, of the psychedelic closet, and be very open about my experience and honest about what we went through. And I was extremely uncomfortable with that. I never really wanted 15 minutes of fame doing anything. I was very happy being in the background. I'm somewhat of an introverted person. So, getting attention like that the idea of it was very uncomfortable for me. So we told them we would think about it and get back to them. When the clock was ticking at this time, this was on the heels of the Trump re-election. And it was important that this campaign, if it were to start, to get on that ballot, because the more presidential ballots get more voter turnout, the higher your voter turnout, the higher likelihood your campaign will succeed. So it made logical sense to try and kind of rush this in and get this on that ballot. It was November of 2019, and I had been having conversations back and forth with them. I was still kind of leaning towards no, I'm not going to do this. And it got to a point where they're like, we have to submit this paperwork tomorrow to the Board of Elections if we want to get on this ballot, because we need time to get signatures. And I said, this is final answer, but I have to turn this down. I cannot guarantee that my children won't have any negative blowback from this. And at that time, I had relief from my depression. I felt like I just got my life back together. And why would I want to do something to potentially risk all this and throw everything awry again and make my children go through yet another thing? So I put down the phone, went to bed, and I just started bawling. And Daniel was like, what's the matter? Like, you should feel relieved from this decision. You should feel happy about this. And, you're doing the right thing for your family. And I was like, I just feel like this is the wrong decision. And I feel like people need to hear my story. And it's probably more common than I realize. So we kind of talked this idea through, and the downsides of doing it and the upsides of doing it. And, we started Googling everybody on the Dr. Brodder's team to see if it was legit, and if the attorney was legitimate, and, and everything turned out legit, of course. So we just decided, okay, I'll call them in the morning and I'll make this right. And I'll tell them that I will do it. It just, something in me felt wrong for saying no. So I texted them and I said, I changed my mind. Is it too late to submit the paperwork? And they were like, absolutely not. They were so excited that I changed my mind. I think for them, they wanted this to proceed. They were going to proceed without me. And they knew it just would have been so much of a better campaign if I was the spokesperson for it and I was leading it, because I am a working mom and that touches hearts and minds. And it's just a much better story to tell than the cannabis advocates are trying to advocate for psychedelic advocates, because that comes with its own set of issues. So we got the paperwork ready. I went to the Board of Elections and I filed the paperwork. And then we went on Christmas vacation for 2 weeks. We went down to my husband's family in Alabama, and we didn't say a word about this to anybody. We had no idea what was about to happen in our lives anyway. But, I think this was very important. Like, my entire life, I always went to my parents and asked them their advice on everything. And God bless them. They're wonderful people, but they also grew up in a completely different kind of society and had a different kind of life than I do. And I knew this was a decision that I needed to be comfortable with. And if I got feedback from other people, then that would potentially make me want to back out of it. So I wanted to kind of get that resolution in my mind straight and feel 100% confident with this. So we just didn't talk about it with anyone over Christmas. And we came back right after New Year's, we came back here, and the next week we launched the campaign. And of course, we did it at the Mellow Mushroom in Washington, D.C. And it was the first time I had told my story in a very public forum. And it was a group of very friendly people who were already on board with this issue. But it felt really amazing to be in a room of people telling them about the worst time in my life, and seeing the heads nod and people vocally supporting me, and friends that showed up that had no idea what was happening, and to see their faces in the crowd and see the shock of they didn't know everything that we were going through and how terrible it was for us. And it was just the first time that I came out there, and it was amazing. And I had a really good feeling about this. So, there was NPR reporters there. At this point in time, I still hadn't told any of my family about this. So the story ran on the radio the day after, and my aunt was like, "Did I just hear you on NPR?" I was like, "Yes." She's like, "And you're talking about drugs?" I'm like, "Yes." And it was just like, it was so shocking to them that they like didn't know how to react to it, because I mean, I come from an Iranian family, and, you know, being open about drug use and being open about anything controversial, period, is pretty taboo. And I think it was just such like a move out of left field for them. They were like, okay, well, we'll just wait and see what happens here. You know, like no one really knew what to expect. So that kind of like kicked off this whirlwind that's been the last few years of my life in the political space for psychedelic advocacy. And it's been a crazy ride ever since.
Right. Yeah. It's not getting any calmer.
No.
That's for sure.
No, not at all. Yeah.
So what was it that made you want to kind of build out the board and invite folks like me to come help support this project?
Yeah. So, well, to back up, so I ran the Decriminalize Nature DC campaign. It was crazy, not because it was a psychedelics campaign, but because it was COVID. It completely transformed how you run a signature campaign. And we got a lot of really amazing press out of it. We ended up winning with 76% approval in DC, which that made history. And, you know, no ballot initiative had ever won by that big of a margin before.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was wild to see me dedicate my life to something like this and see it be so insanely successful. And it was really because, you know, there was a very specific niche that we had and very intentional approach that we took to this. And it was different than, you know, than any other way that psychedelics had ever been talked about. You know, I was really honest about my story. So there was a lot of storytelling whenever I'd have a conversation with anybody, whether it be a reporter or a voter. And then we thought it was really important to make the logical argument. And with DC voters, are very well informed, very educated. We had to kind of explain to them the science behind it and the fact that this research existed in the 50s and 60s. And, you know, it was being conducted by the United States. You know, there was federal funding towards this, and it got cut off for political reasons. So, you know, we were making these really good arguments, and winning by 76% really showed that there is like an appetite for this here. And it kind of also showed me that like, this is much bigger than us, like our local city campaign that we're running. And not only am I having a great time with this, but I am professionally feeling very fulfilled, like kind of just like brainstorming with my campaign steering committee, like, how do we turn this into something? Like, what are the needs for the psychedelics movement in Washington, D.C.? And, you know, of course, like focusing on like federal work. I can literally see the Capitol Dome from my bedroom window. So like, we are in the thick of it here. What's the need here? And me with one of my steering committee members, who's now also a board member for Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, Molly Allen, you know, she's like, there needs to be an association that represents the entire movement in DC. And together we came up with like, not, you know, there are trade associations all over the city. They are very powerful in their influence with Congress and the rest of government. But we wanted to approach it a bit differently, in that, you know, it's not just businesses in the space, that incorporate advocates, practitioners, researchers, as well as business. We all know, and your listeners, I'm sure, understand that, you know, psychedelics is a bit of a different subject. There's so many different cross sections here. It's not just like a medical therapy, it's a spiritual experience. There's ecological impacts. There's just too many cross sections for us to just purely create a trade association. So we created Psychedelic Medicine Coalition as kind of like this hybrid organization that kind of encompassed everybody and took a very big tent approach to our advocacy. So there's a lot of hot debate on what approach we should take to reforms, but in our minds, any approach that moves the needle forward in the right direction, which means it's providing access to people, safe access to psychedelics, that is something that we can support, no matter how small of a reform it is. So when we started this, I wanted to be really intentional about who we brought on in leadership positions and what this organization looks like. Because I know it couldn't look like anything that has ever existed before, but also we needed to be viewed as legitimate, our audience's perspective, which our audience could be congressional staffers, members of Congress, officials in the administration, potentially the president's office. So, we needed to appear like a traditional association, but function as like this kind of all-encompassing organization.
Mm. And it seems really well orchestrated right now. I know we're still kind of growing and in the early stages, but it does seem like you've been successful in kind of generating that perception, which is good. And I don't know, how do you describe the organization right now in terms of goal or agenda? I have my story, but I'm sure you say it better.
I mean, our biggest goal right now is, and the most important thing we can do is to properly educate members of Congress about these issues. When we first started in 2021, and I think this is just a symptom of being in the psychedelic space and how much excitement there is, but we assumed that there was baseline knowledge about psychedelics. Some people don't even really, some offices didn't really understand the word psychedelics. I think they would think, immediately think of the 60s and LSD and how that just totally got out of hand, or a lot of them had no idea that there are research institutions right now that are looking at this and researching these and coming up with really impactful studies and having amazing results. But the education has been a really critical piece about this. And, it's all to get to our short-term goals of getting federal research funding for psychedelics. So, I think that there are other issues on a federal level that are really important, like descheduling. But in anticipation of the counter argument to that, which is it's not time to deschedule. We don't know. We need to see more data. We're getting ahead of it and saying, all right, well, allocate some funding towards creating that federally funded data so that we can then make the argument to deschedule. I think that there is support to deschedule things now, but it's really important that we get as many people on board with this subject before that happens to kind of quell any political opposition we would have to this. That's why the storytelling piece is so critical. Whenever I have a meeting with somebody, as you start with the story, it kind of breaks down those barriers, and then you hit them with the science. And that just once they're open to this topic, the science just it's just the facts, this is not my opinion. These are what the studies are saying. And that has become a really effective method in getting people to understand what psychedelics are about and what the potential is here. So, for us, it's, we could just be advocating really hard and fast for descheduling, and that could work, but it could also create an opposition where there isn't an opposition right now. This is one of those issues that is one of the only issues right now that's just truly bipartisan. Something that has support from AOC, who is extremely politically divisive to one side, to Matt Gaetz, who is extremely politically divisive on the other side. Both of those members of Congress have been very vocal in their support for psychedelic research. And we get to be when we're having this discussion, why we focused on research, it's we can make it extremely simple for them. We're not talking about decriminalizing. We're not talking about descheduling. We're simply asking for the research. And that is something that is very benign to our politicians. And it does show them that we're being very practical about our approach here. And we're not asking for too much. And we're not asking them to take big steps that they don't want to take. These are the baby steps that we're going to need to take to get them to take those big steps further down the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you had before even getting funding, I think you said something along the lines of you educated 200 senators and staffers.
Yeah.
In the course of a year. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I think right now
it's incredible.
Yeah. Right now it's a bit over 200, but yeah, we've spoken to 200 different offices. And it's not simply just like getting meetings with staff on the Hill. There's like various approaches here. Like I said, I've been in DC for 20 years. We've worked locally here my husband's worked locally for 20 years in local DC. I'm in 10 years in. We have friends that work on the Hill. We have friends that are fundraisers. There are other approaches you can take, like softer approaches than just like directly asking for a meeting, attending meet and greets with politicians, getting invited to fundraisers, having those conversations outside of a formal office meeting are extremely impactful in a way that's like a lot less tangible. It's really key to be kind of in the mix with these people and capitalize on, the friendships that we've made here in the city for so long that it's kind of like we are, while my resume has not been 20 years of drug reform advocacy, my entire career has kind of given me the skill set that I need to do this work now and the access that I have to do this work now. So it is really just like the perfect time for me personally to be taking on this endeavor, because it's now come to an inflection point where it's like, well, I have been grinding for so many years here in the city, and it's definitely a grind. DC has its own pace and its own intensity. And now hopefully I can get it to pay off for the psychedelics movement and to try to create access to psychedelic therapy for people and truly change people's lives. There's so many problems with society, and it's almost like overwhelming at times to see everything that's going wrong. But this is the one thing I think that is going in the right direction and can really change how we interact with each other and how we live our lives day to day.
Yeah. The degree to which it can help individuals is massive. And then, when we look at the relational aspects and like healing relationships and communities and wounds between communities, it's a long way we can go here.
Oh, absolutely.
But we need the data to convince these folks.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that it's very easy to just talk about mental health and saying that that's a priority for you. But like, if, I go down this road and like I have changed one person's life, that's not just one person's life. That affects their partners, that affects their children, it affects their friends, it affects their community. Like this, it kind of like creates this web of positivity really in that person's life that, where they were probably dreading their day to day, their relationships suffer. I know when I was going through my depression, my marriage was in a terrible place. We went to couples counseling, and that was a way for my husband to get me into therapy because I was so disengaged with therapy on my own. Like I said, I was somewhat of an absent mother. I wasn't very affectionate and loving towards my children. And like to think about the long-term ramifications of that, if that continued, that affects their lives, their friends, their friendships, their partners. Yeah, it's definitely like this is very big what we're trying to accomplish here in the psychedelic space. This affects so many people. And I think that COVID kind of brought all these issues to the forefront for everyone, not just our politicians, but everybody. There's so much stressors in our daily modern life that I think that it forced us to all take a pause and acknowledge that we're not all okay and we need to come up with better solutions.
Mm-hmm. So where to next? I kind of want to jump over to, it's a good pun, Mr. Pollan's opus.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to call it that, but so this brand new Netflix series, Michael Pollan's kind of the star. Is it just How to Change Your Mind? Is that what it's called?
Yeah. How to Change Your Mind.
So you were featured in it in a mescaline episode. And as we're recording, it just came out this morning, right? So I've not seen it at all. You kind of only saw a little bit, but thinking you were in the psilocybin episode because you have experience with psilocybin and ayahuasca.
Yeah.
But you were in the mescaline episode.
Yeah, it's kind of strange.
It's an interesting decision.
Yeah, and I get why they did that. You know, my experience with psilocybin was outside the clinical setting in a very illegal kind of format. And the people that they featured in the psilocybin episode, you know, one was a cancer patient, one was somebody diagnosed with OCD, and they both did it in a clinical setting. I think that makes the lawyers really happy when that happens. Just, you know, there's various, you know, the corporate lawyers, when they get their hands on something, like I wrote a piece for Good Housekeeping, and it got like shredded by the legal department because they were very nervous that, you know, I was admitting to breaking the law. And they have an image, of course, like Good Housekeeping is like so iconic in its own way that I had to have a disclaimer as my subtitle, which I wasn't really happy about, that said, I don't recommend this for people. And then like a lot of pieces of my story were left out, but it was fine. I mean, I get why, you know, it's just a very good reminder that, you know, while we're making a lot of progress, there's still so much progress to make here. But yeah, I got put in the mescaline episode because, you know, these issues, this kind of like this new psychedelic renaissance is not new to many Indigenous groups in the US. You know, they've practiced with peyote for centuries. And what's happened is as interest has grown in taking psychedelics for either for mental health or recreational use, you know, this is a hot topic right now. And what they've seen is there is peyote that's grown out in the United States is just getting decimated right now because people are harvesting it illegally and not doing it in the most sustainable way. So peyote takes a really long time to grow. It's not super plentiful. So this has become an issue for Indigenous groups, rightfully so, because this is their practice. This is their religion. This is their spirituality. It's tied to everything they do. It's not like we can just hand them synthetic mescaline and say, you know what, we're sorry we did this. Here, we'll make it up to you. Here's some mescaline. It's like they really believe that these plants have a spirit in it. They absorb the environment around them, and they approach this very thoughtfully and carefully. And because psychedelics has become such a popular topic in mainstream media, that, you know, this is now affecting their practice and it's become an issue. So my episode kind of talks about how Decriminalize Nature brought these issues to light and how it somewhat, in a way, pitted advocates against Indigenous groups, because to them, they would just like our hands off of peyote, rightfully so. And there are certain parties in the advocacy space that, you know, believe that everyone should have access to everything. If we're truly talking about freedom to, you know, heal yourself and heal your mind, it should not preclude any of the plants or substances. You know, we should have all of it accessible for everyone. And that's caused a lot of problems for various people inside and outside the Indigenous space.
Chacruna put out an article recently addressing this quite directly. And I suggest some people go read it. Yeah, there's lots of controversy here. And if people are interested in the peyote topic, there's a new podcast with Miriam and Cody from River Styx Foundation, IPCI, and really amazing conversations about, you know, what's going on there in these worlds. And really, yeah, it grows back very slowly. And the spirituality around this is really, really fascinating and pretty beautiful. So apparently, in some traditions. Like peyote is the ancestor, and it actually contains ancestors too. Your ancestors are in peyote. So even peyote being grown in like Vietnam, Thailand, where it's kind of common to be cultivated, like people in some tribal groups actually want to go repatriate the peyote, actually go over, say, why are you doing this? Can you please stop doing this? This is our ancestors, like stop, like, and then bring them back. It's a really complex, convoluted thing. And my position is Native Americans have suffered plenty.
Yeah.
We need to give them space to do their thing, provide support where appropriate, if asked for, I guess. And yeah, see how we can support them. And peyote has been a massive part of how many Native American traditions have healed from genocide, colonialism, etc. So
yeah,
it's
so
a really
sad
important
to
part.
see the progress that has happened with peyote and the advocates. And for us, while we were doing the Decriminalize Nature DC campaign, as soon as I started getting into psychedelics, I of course did a deep dive and I was reading everything you could possibly read about psychedelics. But at the time, this was a very new issue to me. And once I started to read about the Indigenous perspective on it, I was like, well, like we need to not include this in our initiative. What's a way to circumvent this? So in our language, we put mescaline containing cacti. And while peyote is a mescaline containing cacti, and that's technically decriminalized, as a part of that, I made a point to reach out to our Indigenous groups here locally and kind of get their blessing on this. And I think that they were fine with mescaline containing cacti. I think that they would prefer, I think the best thing to do is just to have it explicitly said, excluding peyote in the language. I think that that's the best way forward. I know that there is an effort by Indigenous groups to reform the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act so it more incorporates cultivation issues and the ecological impact of this. And, I think that I agree with you 100%. Like we should defer to the Indigenous groups on this issue. This is their medicine. And whether you believe that it should be all for all people or not, like at the end of the day, yeah, they have suffered enough. And they've lost so much of their culture and their lives that who are we to say, no, this isn't, you don't know better. Like we know better. And it's so arrogant of us to tell the groups that, this practice originated with that we know better, because we don't. And I think that it's all gone so south, and it's really just like, I don't understand like why we just can't have conversations about this and kind of come to consensus on this issue. It's really sad to see the feelings that Indigenous groups harbor towards these kind of initiatives. And I get it. They have every right to want to preserve the practices that are still intact for them. It's a way to heal communities in a very real and major way. And we should always just defer to the Indigenous groups when it comes to peyote. I think that they do own this, and we should follow their lead here.
Yeah. And, I will, because we love complexity at Psychedelics, I will say this is complex. There isn't absolute consensus, but this is issues that perhaps we shouldn't be involved in until those groups kind of can help us understand it. I've talked to Native American folks, Chicano folks, who are all very okay as individuals sharing this with others, including white folks. And it's really complicated to me. I don't totally understand it, but I know that it's so complex, and the environmental impact is really explicit. Like, these things are rare now, becoming more rare all the time. Probably, a good point in history to stop consuming things that are, possibly on the verge of being very endangered.
Yeah.
If not already. I don't actually know the actual status, but I saw John Mayer wear a peyote shirt recently, and I'm like, no, don't, John, wrong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the good thing about this is that it is bringing this issue to light, and there is now a concerted effort to conserve peyote. You have the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund that's just starting up now, and it's to raise funds to preserve it and other medicines that can be endangered. Because in actuality, like, where does ayahuasca come from? It comes from a plant in South America. And, we've been hearing for well over a year now that the ayahuasqueros are traveling further and further and further to cultivate it. And it's because that ayahuasca tourism has picked up so intensely that the natural supply of it's going down. And now we're hearing it with iboga as well. So it's kind of like the cycle of things. I wish it didn't have to get so bad before attention was brought to this issue. I think it's much easier to start it by, looking at the entire system and like what the potential downfalls of something would be, rather than to try and repair something like this. But I think that there's enough well-intentioned people in the psychedelics movement that want to see this done the right way, that we can come up with a result that appeals to Indigenous groups. I think we have a long way to go, though, but it has to start with having an open dialogue about this and being open and being humble to know that we don't know everything, and being willing to learn throughout the process.
So how did you feel very misrepresented with how they included you in the piece?
Somewhat. I do feel like the mescaline episode highlighted the issues with peyote for sure. They interviewed some of the leaders in the Indigenous space for this. And then, it kind of, they would cut in between the Indigenous perspective, and then there was the Decriminalize Nature Oakland team that was featured, and then Decriminalize Nature DC team that was featured, kind of side by side. And for the Decriminalize Nature DC campaign, we were very much on the side of the Indigenous groups. As soon as we found out this was an issue, it was something that I addressed immediately with groups like the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Fund. I thought it was really important that I reach out to them immediately and let them know that, I'm not looking to fuck shit up for you. Like I don't want to cause waves with our initiative. I just want to educate people about psychedelics, and I do not want to cause harm. And, that's kind of when the DNDC side separated a bit from the DN Oakland or DN National side, because they kind of doubled down in their stance during this time to allow peyote in our initiatives. And we kind of backed out of that. And I made it a point to, whenever we talked about our language and what this ballot initiative did, I made it a point to say, not including peyote. Peyote is on the verge of being endangered. No one should be doing peyote right now. And we should be following Indigenous leaders' lead here with this issue. And I do think that we did kind of get grouped in with the Decriminalize Nature Oakland folks. And, that's their perspective. But now it's so far beyond a perspective that this is having like real life impacts to people's lives and communities. And I'm not okay with that. It's causing, the whole point of like all the work that we're doing is to try to make things better for society and better for humanity. And I think this peyote issue is just so touchy and so complex that, if we continue without being in lockstep with Indigenous groups, that this is just going to cause more harm than necessary. And I'm so honored to be featured in the series. It's like I'm in a Netflix series, and that's really crazy. And this was like such an important moment in my life. But I am a little bummed that I got grouped in with a group that's like in direct opposition to Indigenous groups, because that was like the one thing that I wanted Psychedelic Medicine Coalition to have as one of our pillars, is that, I will never charge Indigenous groups for membership fees. I will always advocate for them on their behalf if they ever wanted me to. And I do feel like I need to take a step back now and really address this head on with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The time is right. It seems like the Decriminalize Nature folks are being a little inflammatory and trying to cause more of a stir here to, hold their stance really firm. They've said in the past a number of times, they're not a drug policy organization. They're a human rights organization, which is fascinating.
But are Indigenous people not human? It's
a great question. Yeah. How do we balance human rights? Everybody gets the same thing. Like, who owns it? Just because you're an educated American with the benefit of, going to Ivy Leagues, like, you can then say this is how everything should be. It's tough. Like, consent is important, and we don't necessarily have consent.
No.
One or two tribal members telling you that doesn't count.
Yeah. That's like the major thing that I'm hearing from Indigenous leaders is we never got their consent for this. And I think the reason why they're on board with California's decrim measure is that they were brought to the table very early on with Scott Wiener's office. And they were a key player in this. And that is literally all they're asking for is have us at the table. These issues affect us, and listen. And the listening is so key to all of this. And like I said, I think that there's something like oppressive about their approach that it's like, well, we know better. And this is where more and more, the more you oppose them or counter them, the more steadfast they are in their opinions on this. And this is not very psychedelic at all. This is like the opposite of what we're all trying to accomplish. And the consent has not been made for us to pursue this. So why are we continuing to do the same thing? It's just insanity to me. I would hopefully see this as a turning point. Maybe this is good that I was included in the mescaline episode, because it's in a way like forcing me to address these issues with the Indigenous groups and start to build that bridge and build that trust again, because the trust is very broken right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's tragic. We have so much more work to do. And without trust, we can't really go very far. And this is a very complicated field we're all in. And to pretend it's simple is silly.
Yeah. And it's okay to move slow too. I think that we're all really excited. There's a dire need for mental health services to improve in this country. So many people are suffering. Opioid addictions are through the roof. The pandemic made all of this worse. There is a sense of urgency here, but when it comes to creating public policy, it's better to be thorough from the beginning and put in place from the beginning a policy that is not harmful to people. And, we're kind of seeing this with cannabis reform, in that there was just such a mad rush, like almost a gold rush, for cannabis reform on a state level. And the federal side was a bit neglected or left behind, or the messaging was a little different on the federal side. But, now we have people who are making millions and millions of dollars off the cannabis industry, while men, predominantly Black men, are in jail right now for minor cannabis offenses. And I think that if we just brought this issue up from the very beginning, maybe we would have a different result by now. But it just got so politicized at the federal level that we're kind of at this stalemate. I do think that we are closer to cannabis legalization than on a federal level than we've ever been, but so much time has been lost. Cannabis reform has been happening for decades now. And our federal government is just so far behind on this.
Mm. Yeah, patience and going slow is a really interesting conversation generally here. You know, we both know somebody who was sentenced to 2 life sentences and got out somewhat early. And, you know, he's been on the podcast. Like, that was too much. That was far too much of a sentence for that crime. And how many people are still in jail for, you know, LSD, psilocybin, et cetera. And, you know, it's unconscionable. I think any drug prisoner it's a very unreasonable thing. Just because you had something in your pocket, you can get put in a cage for years or decades. Unreal that we live in that kind of situation. So how do we be patient there? And then, you know, with veterans, like how can we like cultivate patience when so many people are committing suicide or suffering so severely? It's really hard.
Yeah.
And I don't have a good answer. I just like to put it out there.
Yeah. There's no good answer here. It's just kind of like the best path forward possible. How do we proceed with psychedelic reform without causing more damage than there already has been caused? And yeah, this is a concern. Like, we're at the very early stages of this. You know, now police departments everywhere are learning about psychedelics, and, you know, while previously they weren't a target, are we creating targets on our backs because of this? You know, it's not all peace, love, and whatever with psychedelics. There is going to be blowback to this at some point. And, you know, how do we move forward and minimize that impact? I read a story the other day of a nurse who was microdosing with psilocybin. She's caught and may go to prison for this. And it's just like, okay, I guess this is like the beginning of arrests like this, you know, where this was a quiet secret you had that you would engage in your home usually, or in a friend's house or somewhere trusted. Like, now the psychedelic renaissance is getting legs and people are finding out about it. And there's going to be a moral opposition to this, because people still have it in their head that like drugs are bad. You know, even my own mother, when I told her about my microdosing years ago, she was like, well, if drugs are good, why aren't they legal? And to her, that argument was so simple, you know? Oh. And like, we just can't expect your like everyday average American to understand what happened with the drug war and what the motivation was behind it and how this impacts people's lives and who takes drugs and, you know, why they take drugs. You know, like, this is a new conversation for people, and we need to be patient with it. And we need to be willing to kind of humble ourselves and bring ourselves down to the level where people can understand these arguments.
Right. So it's a lot of storytelling. It's a lot of education, and we just really need to ramp it up. Right. Like,
yeah. As many conversations as you can about psychedelics, the better. And you never know, like, you could just be speaking to someone random in the grocery store. You never know what they will take from that conversation and who they'll share that with. And if that person they're sharing it with is a city official or something, you know, like that as many conversations we can have that we show psychedelic use and practice in a positive light, the better. And that's why, you know, it's completely why the Decrim DC campaign was successful, is that people tried to poke holes in our campaign and they weren't successful. You can't just say like, oh, she was just a burnout that won't, you know, wanted to take drugs freely. Like, I'm not. I'm a mother. I have 2 little children that demand so much of my time. I'm a professional. I've got 2 graduate degrees. I'm like well educated, and I'm fully aware and in control of myself. And I did drugs to get myself out of a bad situation. I did drugs to save my life. And that's a very powerful statement for people. So the more people that, you know, the quote unquote normal people, everyday average Americans that come out and, you know, share their stories, the bigger impact this has.
Agreed. Yeah. So, Melissa, do you want to say anything kind of final here, or links you want to shout out?
I definitely want to shout out PMC's links. I think that signing up for Psychedelic Medicine Coalition's newsletter is a great way to stay informed of what's happening in Washington, D.C. and beyond. We send out newsletters regularly, and, we highlight some of the latest journalistic pieces, the latest in research, but also the latest in politics and what's going on a federal and state level. There's so much movement happening with psychedelic reforms, especially on a state level, and in states that you would never even think about, being at the forefront of psychedelic reform, like Oklahoma, Missouri, Vermont, Rhode Island. There's Pennsylvania. These issues are catching on, and a lot of this is happening not because advocates are pushing for it, it's because lawmakers themselves are interested in the subject matter. That we need to stay on top of it. And there's so many people that reach out to me that want to get involved and don't really know how, have never been very political people, and this is a great way to see what the opportunities are. Also, we just launched Psychedelic Vote on our website. That is a legislation tracker that goes by state. It is on our website, psychedelicmedicinecoalition.org/psychedelic vote. That is a great way to stay abreast of what's going on a state level. And, eventually, I think once we get some more traction with federal government and things start moving there, we'll definitely have those updates up on our website as well.
Well, outstanding. Melissa, this is great. I really appreciate all your hard work and bravery. This is not simple or easy work, but we need to do it. And thank you for being a leader here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joe.
Absolutely. And let's do more, please. There's a lot more stories we need to tell, I think.
For sure. Thank you so much.
And there you have it, Melissa Lavasani, CEO of the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, and really, really great player in the space. Thankful to be aligned with Melissa and just really excited for what Psychedelic Medicine Coalition is going to do in the future. So hope you all enjoyed this particular episode of Psychedelics today. I think that's it for now. And please do join us on the next episode. If you did like this, please share with a friend and maybe post on your socials or something. Or just leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, etc. We really appreciate it. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. This is Joe Moore signing off. We'll see you on the next episode. Bye-bye.